Okay, so you guys can all see we're promoting Eric up here. Christie Kerner, a colleague of mine and director of venture development at Startup AZ, and also CEO of My Little Mascara Club. I'm a big fan and a customer. We're happy to have you here today moderating a talk with Eric Ries, CEO of the Long-Term Stock Exchange and best-selling author of The Lean Startup. We're so thankful for your introduction. Matt Sherman from our community made that introduction for us today. We're thankful for your time. And I just have a little antidote before Christy dives in. I was driving my kids around, I believe it was over the weekend, listening to NPR, and they had the CEO of Robinhood on there, and the very intelligent journalist was asking him some questions about how he started Robinhood. And he said, I read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and started going into basically giving away all the secrets in your book. So you need to call him. Okay, guys, have fun.
Thanks. Eric, pleasure. Thanks for joining us here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for making time, and thanks for having me. This is great. And I didn't even know about this Robinhood thing, so I even got a plug on the radio. I'm psyched.
No kidding, right? All right, well, so before we jump in to all of the very fun business things that we can chat about, seeing as how you are such an icon in the world of everything startup here.
About that, but thank you. Yeah.
Let's take a second to just understand Eric as a human to start. So where are you from? Where are you now?
I grew up in San Diego, California, where my family still is. So now I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area. Have rode out the pandemic basically in quarantine in this house here, pretty much. And growing up in San Diego, you become so used to nice weather that you come to San Francisco and it's like it's okay, but it's not great. So yeah, I'm definitely spoiled.
That's fair. That's fair. Obviously, in Phoenix, when we want to go to the beach, we are heading over to San Diego. So
oh yeah, for sure.
You can certainly relate with that one. So if we were to try and reverse engineer what makes a person so zany and clear about what it takes to build a startup, help us understand what you looked like in high school. Just curious.
Oh, yeah, high school.
What were you doing? Which clubs were you in? Like, who were you?
Yeah, so listen, if you have a stereotype in your mind of the kid who grew up programming computers in their parents' basement who didn't get enough time outside, that was me. I went to San Diego High School. I did the International Baccalaureate program. I was in all kinds of like science nerd competitions that you can remember. For those that did that kind of thing as a kid, that was me. But my real love was computers. I loved computer programming ever since my dad brought home a beige gray IBM XT with a 5.25-inch floppy disk. For those that remember that particular device, I was totally transfixed. I remember begging them to buy me a used the beige boxy Mac Plus, for those that remember that, which I hand assembled and disassembled to add an extra 256K of memory back when that was a lot. So I was very into computers, into MUDs, for those that remember what that was, and programming. And I couldn't believe when I found out kind of towards the end of high school that you could make money as a computer programmer, like as a job. That to me was like discovering you get paid to eat candy all day. It was amazing. So yeah, I actually talked my way into all kinds of programming internships that I wasn't remotely qualified for. I actually published a part of a programming book in high school that I had kind of talked my way into. So yeah, I was a precocious but very nerdy young person.
Interesting. But it also sounds like quite a bit of drive and ambition mixed in there too.
Yeah,
like,
I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Yeah. So like, I don't know. I was hungry for more. I didn't want to just to be a regular student. I did well in school. I was very lucky that way. I had very supportive parents, but I didn't find that very satisfying. And programming spoke to me in a certain way. And yeah, and I don't know how other people feel about it, but to me, programming just seemed like such a natural way to change the world. Yeah. Through the power of your mind. And at that age, that really appealed to me. So if anyone remembers Usenet, okay, this is now a blast from the past, but Usenet used to be the way that people communicated in kind of group settings on the internet, the early internet. So I had learned, this is the mid 90s. We're talking about early 90s. And I had learned to program Java programming at a time when that was a brand new beta language. and Sun Microsystems had launched it with great fanfare in the classic tech way, where they had just spent too much money on too much PR, and there was crazy hype about it. So like any random person could just download the compiler and learn Java. I did, I was a kid. And next thing I know, on Usenet, there's this incredible demand for Java experts. And people have these job postings that would be like, looking for Java expert, 10 years experience required. Well, Java just came out last week. So for whatever reason, I was like, well, I guess I'm as much an expert as anybody in Java. So I started applying for jobs online on Usenet anonymously, because on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. And I just, I was 15, 16, something like that. One of the jobs, most people, when you apply for a job, they write you back and say, send us your resume, send us your, who are you, get your real life identity. So I just delete all those. I was a kid, definitely not going to get into those jobs. But one of the publishing companies was desperate for an author to write a book called The Black Art of Java Game Programming. This is a deep cut now. And they were so desperate that instead of asking me for my resume, they asked me for a sample chapter on a certain topic by next week. And I said, no problem. And you're in high school, writing 20 pages on some arbitrary topic you know nothing about is like, that's all you do.
What you do all day.
So I was like, no problem. Whatever the topic is, I'm definitely an expert in whatever that is. And, they give me the topic and I was like, no problem, whatever it is, no problem. So I sent the sample chapter. They liked it. They wound up hiring me to do this publishing thing. They didn't find out my age until much too late in the process to back out. So that was one of the first programming jobs I had. Yeah.
Okay. So then was that kind of publishing company how you first stumbled upon Steve Blank too? Was that?
No. That was years later. So it's funny. My start in technology was writing was always bound up in it. I loved writing and that was always been a part of me along with programming. And then, if you fast forward many years later, I graduated from college, .com boom comes and goes. I did a terribly doomed startup in college that, could have been LinkedIn or Facebook, but turned into nothing. And then anyway, long story short, I wound up doing a startup in here in the Bay Area where Steve was on the board. And I met him that way. And at the time that I met him, he was just starting to propound this new avant-garde theory called customer development in a ridiculously cafe press self-published volume called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And although now that book has been properly published and properly edited and revised, if you're a real true legend, you have, as I do, the original unfiltered, uncut live album, which is way better than the final product. It was awesome.
Okay, so sidebar here. I'm picking up on maybe a love of music. Is this something that's a part of your world?
I do love music. That's true. You can't see, this is my makeshift home studio as well as my home office.
Okay, we are going to have to dive into this sidebar just a little further here. So what do you mean home studio? Do you like to produce music as well? Or what are you doing over there?
Yeah. I'm not seriously. I don't, please don't, I don't want to playing music maybe is a little bit strong. Producing music is a little
what's
bit
your
strong,
style? What's your vibe? What are you creating over there?
Well, I like the technology of music, of course. So I have all my digital and digitally modeled instruments down here and all my acoustic instruments upstairs. So I'm not so much a genre musician. I couldn't possibly play a session in a studio, but I love music and an idea of music theory, music production. So have learned a lot about that over the years as a hobby.
Okay, then give me 2 artists that you like the sound of. Just got to give us something to imagine with here, Eric.
Well, okay, so as a nerdy child growing up at that time, They Might Be Giants, is critically important, and Jonathan Colton and kind of that genre music force, very important to me. But then, from a pure sound point of view, the sonic, the what you can do with a Led Zeppelin or even Rush, I think that kind of pop composition style of those kinds of artists is incredible. This is not what I thought we were going to be talking about, but I'm happy to chat about it. It's great. I usually get asked only boring questions. This is awesome.
We can read all about lean startup everywhere, but it's kind of fun to understand the person that is behind this movement.
Sure, I understand. That's great.
It's really where it's humans that make the world go round, and
I love that. That's such a rare perspective, actually, in this day and age. That's great.
So, before we jump back into some of that, are there any other obscure hobbies that we would love to know about?
I wish. I have young kids. My kids are 7 and 4. So, Hobbies plural. No, I don't have time anymore for anything. Yeah, between doing this kind of thing and running the long-term stock exchange and raise my kids, I don't do much else.
It's a question that I often ask founders and rarely get any answers to because
yeah, I like the Japanese board game Go. For those that know, I played on the 19 by 19 grid. That's a pretty obscure hobby. But yeah, I don't necessarily have much time to play anymore.
All right. Well, thank you for indulging us. Now back to life here. So, all right. So jumping back to, so you met Steve, you kind of really embraced the thought process that he had around how people should be looking at building companies differently. So let me ask you this. I had one time, probably one of my first introductions to the lean startup methodology. Someone described it to me as old school entrepreneurship or founding being more ego-based and new school being more kind of detached or data-driven. Is that like a way that you would resonate with describing it? Or do you think it's too much more complex than that, you know?
Well, I see what they're going for. I get that, but no, I don't think that's quite right. And the reason is, if you study the first-hand accounts, and it's critical that you only look at the first-hand accounts because journalist-driven accounts are wonderful in their own ways, but they don't tend to capture the contradictions and the complexity of what it was really like to do entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
The first-hand accounts of the great entrepreneurs, you will often find proto-lean startup concepts in there. The problem was, like, I'll never forget this. It was a very famous Silicon Valley icon who died prematurely, and some friends of his were trying to get his memoirs published posthumously. And through a whole series of events, I got to read a draft manuscript. I don't believe they've ever even succeeded in getting them published yet. But anyway, reading this draft manuscript, and he's talking about like helping to form some of the legendary foundational companies in Silicon Valley in the 70s and 80s, and just being in the room when critical decisions got made. It's a great rip-roaring story. But anyway, he's trying to give startup advice too. And he starts talking about the founders that he's met and how they were both extremely determined to get to their destination and also bizarrely flexible about how they got to that destination. Now, what he doesn't have is the vocabulary of pivot or minimum viable product. He doesn't have a name for these concepts. And so the chapter, there's a whole chapter about this that is like incomprehensible because he's trying to figure out how to articulate this pattern that he has noticed. But whenever he tries to pin it down, it's kind of confusing and he has to change it around. And I think that's more the difference now, is we have the advantage of much more vocabulary and conceptual machinery that we can use to analyze these things. So yes, that does create new opportunities to bring data to bear. But like some of these famous entrepreneurs were pretty data driven for their time, even going back, you know, to the 20th century titans of industrial entrepreneurship. So yeah, I don't think that's quite right, but I see what they're going for. I would say actually this has more to do with the 21st century style of management as compared to the 20th century style of management. Because when we trained MBAs and we, you know, you think of the success of management as a discipline, the 20th century was a century of tremendous progress and growth in our capacity as a society to manage organizations. And so if you look at the kind of the MBAs and managers of the late 20th century, they were really an arrogant bunch. And management started to become much more about egocentric theories and the Jack Welch, you know, neutron Jack, and Scott Cook calls it playing Caesar in the boardroom, where like you're the emperor and people your subordinates bring you ideas and you decide if they live or die. That's the kind of egocentric idea, and that did trickle down into entrepreneurship with disastrous results. But I wouldn't say that that's especially old school, new school. I think that's more about the kind of style of management and the times that people lived in.
That's interesting. I like that. That's a nice way to distinguish it, because I'm sure you can relate, as any founder would say, there's kind of a deep sense of intuition that at least initiates our hypotheses, if nothing else, right? And so
totally, I get the criticism of lean startup I'll never understand is that it's opposed to having a vision or thinking long-term, having long-term vision, using intuition or human. And it's just like, every time I get that, I'm tempted to go, I've like 3 or 4 times in my life, I've actually gone back, grabbed my copy of the Lean Startup and be like, on what page did I address this topic? Like, I'm always like, did I forget to write that? I'm pretty sure it's on like page 6, you know, like in the introduction, like right there, right up front, the part 1 of the book is called Vision, for God's sake. And people really want
on the journalists. I mean, they maybe just simplified it too much for the.
I don't understand it. I guess because people need a framework. There was actually a very good blog post recently about the Keith Rabois school of thinking and the Eric Ries school of thinking about startups. And it was like established this polarity and then showed how different startups fall at different parts of the polarity. I was like, this is awesome, except I don't really like my side of the polarity that much. Like, I don't agree that's not, I was like, I didn't write any, like what you're ascribing to me, this ethos of anti-vision and experimentation and an empiricism, which like, I see where you get that, but actually it's funny you started with me as a human being. I wanted to be like, you're using my name, but like, I'm actually a human being and I didn't write any of those things. So like, is it really fair to ascribe that to me? But of course, like when you become-
That must be so frustrating.
So weird. You eventually, this took me a lot of years to understand this, like you become the mental character in other people's life drama. So when this person writes about the Eric Ries, whatever theory, he's not actually talking about me, the human who he's never met. He's talking about a mental concept that helped him get through this mental confusion. And so he's actually made characters out of Keith Rabois and he could have called them Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker just as effectively to make his point, because they're arbitrary signifiers of the point he wanted to make, which is a good one about the spectrum of different styles and approaches of entrepreneurship. So I've learned to take it less personally, but it is funny to see how that plays out.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was going to ask you what the biggest misconceptions are around lean startup after now having had it out in the wild for so many years. I mean, is this a part of it or is there something more?
Well, it's funny. I have to check the date now. So, okay, in April of 2010, this is before the book was even published. In April, I wrote a blog post called "The 4 Myths About the Lean Startup," and it's really funny. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, here they are, and they're still true. This is still basically correct. 1, that lean means cheap. So lean startups try to spend as little money as possible. People have been making that mistake from the start. People used to say that about lean manufacturing, about Toyota. This is like a decades old mistake. We can't get people to stop saying that. It's just because we called it lean. Myth number 2, that the lean startup is only for, this is so dated, but like Web 2.0 type companies, right? So like people now would say it's only for apps and, certain kind of consumer products, but that's of course been long since disproven. And it's just a basic misunderstanding that there's the tactics of what you would use. If you have a principled framework, you have to then translate that principled framework into specific tactics that make sense in a specific situation. And there are no such thing as best practices. There are only best practices for some given situation. So every industry, sector, size, like the era has its own different best practices. So yeah, as lean startup gets translated into more and more domains, this seems sillier and sillier, but I still hear it from time to time. Which I think is funny because people have used now lean startup to build rocket ships and Robinhood and and a million other things that health tech breakthroughs and cancer therapies and actually
cool.
crazy stuff. So sorry, that's not true. Then yeah, lean startups are small bootstrap startups, and they shouldn't raise money. I don't know where that one comes from, but I've raised plenty of venture capital in my career. I know lots of lean startup founders that have used venture capital effectively, and ones who have avoided venture capital because they don't like the ethos of that industry. There's a legitimacy to both points of view. And then here, yeah, lean startups replace vision with data or customer feedback. So people are making this mistake for 10 years. And at a certain point, you got to think people are being willful about it. It's like, because like the nice thing about the internet is in the age of the internet, ignorance is optional. So if someone says something wrong or untrue, they could have easily Googled. They're saying it wasn't even worth Googling at one time to find out. They just said it. And so I think that's also very revealing about, about the things that people, it reflects their priorities about what they view to be important and worth spending time on, which I think is interesting.
Ooh, I love it. Well said, my friend. All right. Well, we're going to move into a couple of other topics because our time is limited and I'm excited to talk about some other things.
Sure.
So one of the things that, I don't know, a little bird told me is that you have some opinions about startup governance. And, I love dry topics so much, man. And I could talk about entity structures and tax strategies and things like this all day and be enthusiastic. So I feel like you might be that kind of a nerd on what it takes to kind of build a board, making sure that everything's in symbiotic balance. Like, tell me what it is that you find, that's top of mind for you with this topic, because it is an area that's an important part of founders creating a successful outcome and plan and experience and, all that.
Yeah.
So
When I said first give talks about Lean Startup 10 years ago, I would talk about management and accounting. And I used to laugh that, make a joke in the talk, like, oh, everyone wants to talk about entrepreneurship, they want to talk about something they're exciting. Could anything be more boring than management and accounting? What I didn't know at that time is there is something more boring than management and accounting. It's called governance. Governance is maybe the most boring topic there is. So I'm really drawn to these things that are extremely boring, but at the heart of what drives the world that we live in. And I think the right way to think about governance is actually not so much about board structure and the specific mechanics of it, but really there is an informal but relatively universal agreement among the elites of our society about how our institutions should be governed, as how people should be ruled. It's the space in between government, which is like the specific explicit power of laws by force and consent of the governed and democracy and all that, and the private sphere of individual companies and capital ownership and stuff like that. There's this in-between thing that if all of the elites, if judges and lawyers and rich and wealthy investors, public market investors, venture capitalists, like if there's some belief that is universal among that set of people, then like it actually is kind of like a law that cannot be violated. So much of the way that we structure companies and run them is not really based on any kind of legal precedent so much as it's about what this set of people actually thinks. And founders tend to be very naive on this point when they create new institutions. And a lot of founders I meet, they became entrepreneurs because they hate big companies. They're like, I'm going to get away from all this big company bullshit and the politics and the bureaucracy and the this and that. I always ask them the same question. If you hate big companies so much, why are you trying to create a new one?
Right.
Startups are only small by accident when it doesn't work. So founders tend to get themselves into big trouble here. And the problem becomes, what happens if you discover something genuinely new in this world, a purpose-driven organization, a mission that really matters, that you want to be able to continue for decades or centuries? Like to me, that if you don't have that aspiration, entrepreneurship is kind of a waste of time. Just go do something else. But if you do have that aspiration, it probably won't work. So most startups fail. It's okay. But what if you do? Then what? Have you really created true alignment between all of what they call the stakeholders of the organization? Will the next CEO after you die be able to carry it forward? Will your investors really support you making the right long-term decisions, or will they stage a boardroom coup and get rid of you? And I recommend that if you want some really depressing reading, there's this book called The Enlightened Capitalists. It was written by a business school professor, I think, where he documents 150 years of people trying to solve the problem of doing well by doing good in the world and failing at it. And it's real. If you're a founder, you will find this book incredibly depressing because it's story after story after story of a time when investors, kicked the founder out of the company, or they basically ruined what made the company special and sold it for piece parts again and again and again and again. So I think we in the entrepreneurial community have to start to take governance way more seriously as what are the protections that we should be putting in place for companies so that they can have that long-term alignment. And obviously I literally have a deck of cards on my desk here that we've developed at LTSE for all the I'm like the obscure collector of governance ideas. So someone in the chat saying that's what happened to Elon with PayPal. Like these stories are, we all know the stories, but we just take it for granted that it just happens like gravity. It's like, no, this is not the kind of society we actually want to live in. And if you want to live in a corporate dystopia, we're on track for that. So change is needed.
So it's interesting because in founding companies, we are often not anti-establishment, but at least cowboy, right? Like there's something that we're trying to innovate or change. And so inherently that's kind of an against type of motion. And so what you're saying is if we really care about what it is that we're trying to innovate and change, we cannot avoid thinking about the biggest picture possible and how we can do it in such a way that it will create the long-term impact and not just be a flash in the pan that gets eaten up by all the other priorities of like the ecosystem of economy and life and needs and demands.
Yeah, you can't really be creative around a negative. in the long run. You have to have an affirmative vision of something that you're trying to go towards.
Yeah.
And you don't have to know it all on day one. Like, I don't know if anyone's seen that. There's a very famous video that surfaced a couple of years ago of Mark Zuckerberg being interviewed on a couch at Stanford about the Facebook when it was like really, really new. And they're asking him about his vision for the company. And he's like completely incoherent, he has no idea what Facebook is about to become. You can kind of sort of see how you can see the relationship between what he's thinking at that time and what eventually became the vision of Facebook and how it became world beating. But like, I found it so comforting to be like, okay, good. Even the greats really didn't know what they were talking about at first. That's all right. So like, it's okay if you can't articulate it at first. It takes a while for what is inside your being to become manifest in such a way that you yourself understand it, as true with all great artists. So that's completely fine. But eventually you do have to do that process.
So I liked the way that you kind of started with the highest level of thinking around why with the startup governance, but can you take it down to a couple of like tactical, practical, like implementable, action-oriented things that are on your cards, or what startups should be thinking about in their first year or two?
Yeah, if you're a seed stage, pre-seed startup, there's a couple things you absolutely have to do. Talk to your lawyer about this. And if you don't have a lawyer who thinks it's a good idea, call me and I'll refer you to someone who will help you with this. You need to have special shares that are specific to the founders. Usually they're called founders preferred shares that have special economic and governance rights attached to them. That's like the most important way by which you can keep control of your company. You might have to take that stuff out later. Some investors don't like it, but if you can keep it, it's important. You need to have what I call a board mission pledge. So under Delaware law, most startups are Delaware C Corps. Under Delaware law, your board has very wide latitude to exercise what's called the business judgment rule. That is, like, if they view something to be in the interest of the corporation, then they have a fiduciary obligation to do it, which is a fancy way of saying they can basically do whatever they want. But you can constrain that by having them pledge fidelity to the mission and purpose of the corporation. Obviously that's very complementary with doing something like a public benefit corp or a B Corp, but it's not a requirement to do one to do the other, and they're not mutually exclusive. So I would do at least that. And then there's some other kind of more minor things. Who has the board control is very important. Board votes. So some basic founder friendly provisions that you can put in place there that just. You may as well start that way so that you have the power to make the right governance changes that are needed later, versus you have to kind of negotiate that with a whole bunch of VCs who generally don't really care about that. They have other stronger needs.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Great tips. Thank you, Eric. So, I mean, this is kind of actually, it makes sense to me why you'd be so passionate about this with what you have created next. So it seems like the last 5-6 years, you've been focused on the long-term stock exchange. So tell us what it is and how it came to be. So give us like the origin situation here behind what it is that you are currently focused on.
Yeah, if you actually go back to your old beat up copy of The Lean Startup that came out in 2011, and you turn to the very last page of the book in the epilogue, I sketched out some ideas for future things that we as a startup ecosystem should tackle. And I talked about education and business schools and science and all kinds of stuff. And one of the ideas, very last idea I floated in the book, is we should create a long-term stock exchange, because fundamentally, companies that are governed for the long term are more valuable than companies that are not. Yet we all know that when people take their companies public or their company gets acquired by a public company, the quarterly pressure of our public markets drives them into mediocrity. So it was like, I never understood that. People always say, well, I worked with a lot of companies as a consultant, and, I worked with tons of public companies. And you ask the middle managers, like, why do you do these idiotic things? Cannibalizing all the R&D, canceling the most innovative projects when the quarter is bad, and all kinds of other insane versions of eating the seed corn. They're always like, well, that's what Wall Street wants. I was like, really? Investors want to lose money? Never, ever really understood that. So anyway, the idea of LTSE was to build a national securities exchange. That's the regulatory category that the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are in, that would have listing standards that promote multi-stakeholder long-term governance, a partnership between companies and their long-term investors. Yeah, we started the company, 5 or 6 years ago. First raised money for it in 2016, got SEC approval to operate in 2019. We opened the exchange last year, and we expect our first listings this year. So excited to have some news to share.
What has been the response, since launch or as you've been working on this? I mean, okay, first of all, like my hat is off to you. 5 years of paperwork just to get it to the point where you could do it. Like that had to have been fun. It sounds like you're the right person to take on that kind of thing. But what has been the
like it's like carving the Grand Canyon. You only need water and gravity and an awful lot of patience.
I like it, man. You've got the focus and the simplicity of mindset to stay focused on the goal there. But what has been the response?
It's probably the most polarizing idea I have ever proposed. And you got to remember, Lean Startup was super controversial at the beginning, so I have some experience with polarizing. But
wait, why is it polarizing, man? I mean, it just sounds like pure logic and what makes sense to. I mean,
that's what I'm saying, of course, because you and I are on the right side of the polarity. But if you made your money from trading stocks on a short term, if you were a short term speculator, you made a lot of money from that, it wouldn't sound as logical to you.
All right.
It sound like undermining capitalism in the American way.
Okay.
It's interesting. Like if you look at, I'll just tell you one funny anecdote. I was when we first proposed the idea, when I was first being interviewed about it 10 years ago. Lean Startup had just come out. Wall Street Journal did an article with me, crazy guy with his crazy theory in this new book. And the reporter asked me just for fun, what are some of your other crazy ideas? And I was so young and naive. I'm like, oh, I got this great idea, long-term stock exchange, whatever. So Wall Street Journal runs this article, like crazy guy with crazy idea, has this, it was like, it's very funny. And then when we finally announced the company, years later, the Journal ran an article where they asked a anonymous hedge fund billionaire for a quote about it. And the anonymous hedge fund billionaire said it was a disgusting idea, quote unquote, disgusting, which I was like, wow, that is great advertising. I like, bring it on. If that guy but I was like, he really couldn't put his name on it. He's so scared to say that this thing is disgusting. He couldn't put his name on it. Anyway, years after that, when we finally launched, was it the Journal? I can't remember. One of the reporters called me up about it, and I said, listen, because people have the same question, like, well, why is it controversial? Because it's kind of just common sense, which I'm like, I know, man, tell me about it, but people keep trying to kill us, so they obviously don't think it's a good idea. So I mentioned about this hedge fund guy had said this thing in the Wall Street Journal, and the reporter called me back and called me a liar. He's like, no, he didn't. I went back and checked the Journal, and that's not in there. And I was like, am I crazy? So I went back, and the Wall Street Journal had taken the quote out of a 10-year-old article about this.
Oh no.
And I was like, he was going to write that I was a liar. And then luckily Bloomberg someone else had written an article about the Wall Street Journal article where the guy called me disgusting, where he quoted that part of the article. So there was like proof. And I was just like, what is going on? It's the most bizarre thing. Like this, when I talk to public audiences, startup audiences, people that work for a living, they view this as the most obvious reform. Of course, it's a good idea. And when I talk to grand poobahs, policymakers, when I'm in DC, when I'm on Wall Street, people look at me like I have two heads. Like, why would you ever want to disrupt the status quo? It works so well.
Interesting.
I think that tells you everything you need to know about what's up with our society right now.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, first of all, you have a great ability to detach from the impact of what journalists seem to like to do in this world as related to you. So kudos for that. But no, that's really interesting. So, okay, tell me about your journey here. So, building another company that's a very long-term play. I mean, literally, right? And figuratively, but what has the journey
been
like?
Right in the name of the company.
Yeah, back to like a founding experience and going through that. I mean, typically a founder goes through a lot of kind of emotional highs and lows, and I know this is going to be amazing. Oh my gosh, this is never going to happen. Like, how am I going to bring this into the world? Should I bring this into the world? Yes, this is perfect. No, this is terrible. Like, have you had to go through that, or with the foundation that you've had, has there been the clarity and presence that you needed to just keep pushing forward?
Oh no.
Okay.
Look, I'm from San Francisco, so I can come across as a little woo-woo sometime, but I feel like Phoenix, you're right with me with crystals and whatnot, so it should be okay.
Let's hear it.
I really think my personal experience has been that entrepreneurship is an experience of self-discovery and spiritual growth. Like that's how it's been for me.
Fair.
So first of all, like you don't really know what your vision is or what you stand for until it's put to the test. See, when you fantasize, people who fantasize about creating a company all the time, or like meet seed stage founders where everything's going to be awesome. Before you've really failed and hit the wall, you imagine everything's going to be awesome. The press will love your product. Customers will love it. It will be infinitely cheap and fast and perfect. And, It's going to be awesome. And then reality intervenes and you discover that you have to make a choice. It's like, oh, bleep. This could be really lucrative or really ethical, but not both.
Interesting.
Or like I can serve, like I was working at a company that was like trying to do mental health startup for people with a very specific disability. And like they came to this realization that like it could be used as like a mass market, kind of mindfulness and, personal growth kind of thing for regular people. And they could make a ton of money about that. Or it could be this hyper niche medical device for this very narrow, and they'd never make any money at all. And they had to be like, oh, wait a minute, why did we get into this again?
Sure.
And they were like, did we go do this to make money or to serve the mission? And it was like, everyone acts like that's an easy call to make. But let me tell you, when you're in the trenches, it's not easy at all. You have to discover what you actually really stand for. You could only find that out by testing yourself against the whetstone of reality. And then if you don't find equanimity personally, you cannot, I think entrepreneurship eventually drives you crazy. Like you actually become mentally ill. I know many entrepreneurs who are extremely erratic because I think fundamentally, you don't know if anything that happens to you is good or bad. Okay. So like you launch your product, you're like, boy, I hope a lot of people use it. Yeah. But then it turns out that it has a fatal bug that erases their hard drives. You're like, phew, thank God nobody used it. A second ago, you were depressed that nobody used it. Now you're like, thank God nobody used it. But then you fix the bug and now people do start to use it and you're like, okay, good. So that's something good. But then, and that leads to an investor, gives you a term sheet and you're like, all right, getting a term sheet, that's good. But then you say yes to the term sheet and that guy is now on your board. He turns out to be a total asshole. So actually it was really terrible. And now you have to like fight with him over the control of your company. And, you like in Steve Jobs' case, you get fired from your own company. You're like, well, that's bad. But that allows you to start next, which actually turns out to be good. I could do this all day. Yeah. You don't have any idea whether the things that happen to you are good or bad. And so if you ride that emotional roller coaster with those things, you will actually go crazy. And so you have to find some kind of grounding or centering practice. And, whether you do that through religion or some other kind of spirituality or mindfulness, or, there's a lot of ways and we can always talk about that. You have to find some way to be able to stay present and ride that roller coaster. And I say this to you as if it's like something that I found really obvious, but let me tell you, this has been extremely difficult for me. I am not wired that way. I am extremely highs and lows and very mind oriented and very much like to play chess and think 12 moves ahead and figure out how to control the universe.
Right.
And having really being able to accept that you are not in control of what happens, that reality ultimately is going to be what it's going to be. And your job as an entrepreneur is to see what actually is possible. Everything we do is an experiment. I've been writing that for more than 10 years. But if you really take it seriously, then you have to be like, I don't know. People always ask me with LTSE, especially investors, like, how do you know this is going to be successful? Or reporters ask the question all the time, like, how do you know people are going to do this? Like, you mean, how do I know? How do I know what is going to happen in the future? Normally, if you pretend you know what's going to happen in the future, you get locked up. That's crazy person talk. So, but it's actually extremely hard to be willing to just say, look yourself in the mirror every morning and be like, listen, I don't know what's going to happen here, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Yeah. I fundamentally believe this needs to happen. And so we're going to see if it's possible to make it happen, and we'll accept the outcome of whatever happens. So that's kind of a countercultural view, even in Silicon Valley, where people tend to be very much like rah, ego, make it happen. But that's my 2 cents.
I love it though. That's really, really cool, because in reality, if we don't accept that, then we just make the process harder for ourselves, which gives us less capability to be able to continue pressing forward and creating what it is that we're trying to give this world. So I think that's really, really wise advice there, my friend. I love it.
Someone says I'm the second person who's told them about this thing about self-discovery and spiritual growth, but they didn't say who the other person is. Someone put in the chat, who's the other person? Now I'm really curious. I don't think I've ever heard that.
There's so many good speakers during Phoenix Startup Week. You're the second person to say that. No, we have a bunch of questions. Do you want to take some, Eric?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, I love questions.
Okay, great. Here we go. Is there any evidence that startups are more successful today than 10 years ago, given all the resources, lean startups, incubators, funding that didn't exist as robustly or at all back then?
Great question. That's a great question. No, there isn't sufficient evidence on this point, and we really should be getting some. So people should be doing a lot more academic research here. There are a few studies that have, so the thing you understand in the US, small business formation rates are actually down over this whole period, not up. So although we in the tech industry feel like there are more startups than ever, actually there are fewer startups than there were even 20, 25 years ago, because the technology is shifting power away from small mom and pop, small business type startups to megacorps and conglomerates that are sucking up all the creative energy out of our economy. So good job, tech industry. So we have evidence about changes over time, but I think it's really hard to disaggregate them from these kind of underlying changes in the nature of what a startup is. Now, here's what we know. There's more funding available for more startups, which sounds good, but then you're like, but then that means there's more competition for every good idea. So it's actually not necessarily good. We know that more people have been admitted into entrepreneurship that were previously excluded for all kinds of systematic biases. That's obviously a good thing, but again, that also means more competition. That actually drives failure rates down. We know that there's more international entrepreneurship than ever before, and more cross-pollination of ideas between geographies, which of course is really good, but then again also means more competition, which means, you see where this is headed? So it's pretty hard to say whether we're better or worse at entrepreneurship than before. However, there are a few studies that have looked at the specific management practices that we advocate for entrepreneurs, including Lean Startup. There was a study that was just published through research done at the NSF I-Corps program that showed that not only were the teams that followed the Lean Startup recommendations more likely to be successful than ones that did not, it also validated many of the specific predictions of the theory, not just that they would be more successful in general, but that they would be more successful through specific behavioral things that they were able to identify, that these folks were more likely to do the behaviors that lead to success. So that's very positive. I've seen a few studies like that over the years. I think that if you look at the disconnect between how important entrepreneurship is to our society and our future prosperity, and which is extremely high, and how much energy we put into studying it and researching the very best ways to do it, which is extremely low, it's a ridiculous mismatch. It would be one of the highest ROI things we as a society could be spending time researching and learning about, but it's hard work, so why bother?
Let's move on to the second question. What's the biggest change in the startup world since you've published The Lean Startup?
Well, this is going to sound so dumb. I mean, I've eventually become the old man shouting at clouds. So I guess when I meet kids coming out of Stanford and Berkeley now, when I talk to students and stuff, or very, very young entrepreneurs, they kind of can't believe that anybody had to write The Lean Startup. They're like, this is kind of obvious, old man. Why did you have to write it? And I had to be like, guys, this book is not that old. It was not that long ago that this was considered insane, bonkers stuff. So and they just can't believe it. This is entrepreneurship turns over so fast that new ideas can take, and we're the fruit flies of management science. So we die so quickly. So new ideas take hold in the entrepreneurship ecosystem much faster than in the rest of society. So something can go from completely crazy to obvious pretty fast. And I remember when, this is years ago, when TechCrunch was the preeminent media outlet for startups, they wrote an article about how pivot was the most overused piece of jargon. They were tired of hearing about it. And I was dying laughing because they had gone from ignoring it to criticizing it as overhyped without ever passing through the intervening stage of ever using the term correctly even one time. So that's how we are in startup land. It's everything is, we go from 0 to 180 to back to 0, super, super fast. And so we're very faddish, that's kind of a mess. But I think given that, I'm very proud of the fact that a lot of these startup ideas have been able to have such staying power. Actually, not just in Silicon Valley, but in startup hubs around the world. That's been pretty cool to see.
Yeah, us fruit flies with our Blackberries and rotary phones, right?
Amen.
Here we go. So this question, huge Lean Startup fan. Do you have any ideas for how I can develop my team to be more mindful of Lean decision-making in their own day-to-day?
Sure. Yeah. All you have to do is buy them copies of the book and hand them out. Just kidding. I say that because I saw what I used to do with my team. I was such a bad manager early in my career that I remember the first time I read Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany, I got everyone a copy. I got copies for everybody, distributed them on Friday. I said, starting Monday, we're all going to do this. Now, here's why this doesn't work. It's not just that people are illiterate and cannot read, but it's not the only reason. The problem was we came in on Monday and I said, did everybody read it? Mm-hmm. Everyone's set. We're going to do it. Yep. And then we'd go through the week. And during the week, people would do stuff that's not from the book. And I'd be like, hey, I thought we said we're going to do it from the book. They're like, no, this is from the book. You're like, no, it's not. I read the book. And they're like, no, I read the book too. And people are capable of interpreting anything to mean anything. So it doesn't work. As much as I love books, you don't create cohesive culture that way. If you're having that problem, whoever asked this question, The issue is actually not people's understanding of lean startup. The issue is how you yourself as their manager hold them accountable. This is the hard part. If you really want people to use a specific process, you have to hold them accountable to the results that only that process can give. So to give an example, I once worked with a startup where they were like, lean startup is crap and we don't need to listen to you. And I was like, cool. They were like, but we've been mandated. We have to come to this workshop and work with you, even though you're stupid. I was like, cool. Hey, no problem, whatever. I'm just here to help. I was like, okay, tell me your idea. We had this idea. It's an awesome product, blah, 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 blah. We're about to go to a trade show where we're going to launch this product and we're going to get tons of sales and we're not going to need any lean startup anything. I was like, great. No one would be happier than me if that's true. You can't argue with people and tell them like, you're stupid. It's not going to work, even though of course it wasn't going to work. But hey, maybe it was going to work. I would have been happy to be wrong. So I said, listen, just do me a favor. Everyone just take out an index card. Just write down how many sales you're going to get at the trade show. We're going to sign your name. We're going to put them in this envelope. Let's meet after the trade show and we'll compare notes. So take the envelope with me. We have the trade show, come back, say, hey guys, how'd the trade show go? They're like, it was awesome. Really? We learned so much. It was so great. We met so many great customers. Like we learned a ton and now we're like really set up for success. I was like, oh, cool. How many sales did you make? And our goal was never to make any sales. It's like, oh, really? No, of course, that's ridiculous. Of course we're not gonna make sales. We got a lot of work to do before we're sales ready. I was like, okay, cool. I got this envelope. Let's take a look. Person A says here, you thought you're gonna have 3,000 sales. Person B, oh, you only thought it was gonna be 100. You know, like, and I remember everyone was making fun of you for it, and it was like people had already forgotten that they ever had the goal of making sales. And when we took the cards, they were like, oh no, this trade show was a disaster. Why didn't we make it? And they were like, well, how could we have been so stupid? And then the guy's like, you know what, we didn't know about this critical thing from customers. Anyway, and they started to be like, we have this other trade show coming up. What are we going to do? And I was like, what could we do differently, do you think, at the trade show? And they're like, you know what we need to do? We need to talk to some customers before we go to the trade show. I was like, yes. The other guy's like, you know what we should build? We should bring to the trade show some kind of prototype and show it to them. And I was like, some kind of minimum viable product. They're like, yeah, that thing. That's a great idea. And next thing you know, they're off to the races doing lean startup. And we never had the conversation. That team never, ever, ever even once acknowledged to me that I was right and they were wrong. I'm sure after we'd done with that meeting, they still thought I was just as stupid as before. They still thought lean startup is dumb. But I didn't care. I was like, but they did it. They learned it themselves because somebody had held them accountable to a result that only lean startup could deliver. So it worked. Do that with your team, you'll be in good shape.
I love how all of these ideas are based in management philosophy. That's gold. Next question.
Yeah. We are the management discipline that deals with situations of extreme uncertainty. Sorry.
No problem. No, that's good stuff. Simply curious says the next question. What is the business model for lean startup, if you can shed any light on that?
Oh, for lean startup itself?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much people know about publishing, but like being an author is what they call a tournament system in economics. Like very few authors do well. Most don't make any money at all. And then, you know, books that are popular make a lot of money. So anyone you know that makes money as an author or a public speaker or as a consultant really does all three of those things. So like before I was doing LTSE, when I did lean startup full time, you know, I made money because people bought the book. They would invite, because they read the book, they'd invite me to come speak. I'd speak. People in the audience would ask me to come consult to their company. That would give me new things to write about, which then would give me new things to speak about, which give me new consulting. So like that was the, you know, when I was kind of like a solo operator, you know, itinerant expert. That's how anybody who's a professional speaker, like that's how they make money. That's what the behind the scenes looks like. I gave that up after a while. Like I do a little bit of that here and there, but mostly I got old for me. But also because there's now a whole ecosystem of people who are lean startup experts who are they're better consultants than I am. So I don't really think that I'm like, when CEOs call me up to talk lean startup, like usually what I tell them is that the problems that they're having in their organization, I did it 2 minutes ago. I just did it to that guy who asked the question. The problem in their own organization is their own fault. See, like that's terrible consulting. Nobody ever wants to hear that. Like, look in the mirror, now you're looking at the problem. Like that gets you fired as a consultant instantly. So I'm too blunt to really be super effective there. So there is, but you know, to be fair, there is a lean startup company that does organizational trainings and educational stuff. They're really good at it. We used to, before the pandemic, we used to put on a lean startup conference every year as a public service. Although obviously with the pandemic, it's been not possible to do that. So yeah, don't worry about me. Lean startup has been very, very good to me. But honestly, it's been much more important to me that I've gotten to work on so many interesting startups. That's both been more like the nice thing about being a public figure in the entrepreneurship space is that you get to invest in and work with awesome entrepreneurs. And that's much more lucrative than any amount of money you can make from consulting, speaking, all that kind of stuff.
What about the long-term stock exchange, is the business model for that?
So national securities exchanges are highly regulated financial services companies. So that's actually all of our fees, and that you can look up. We're registered with the SEC. We make money, as all exchanges do, through listing fees that people pay us to list on the exchange, trading fees when trades happen through our execution platform, what's called tools and services. So we sell additional tools and services, including some for private companies. Like if you've seen LTSE Equity, we offer an extremely inexpensive and very cool equity management solution, as well as things like runway planning and those kinds of solutions that if any of you have a startup, you should totally check out. And then we also have data fees. So like if you ever see CNBC, you see the little ticker that's going across the screen. Every time a number goes across the screen, the exchange that provided that number gets paid a fraction of a cent as they go by. So we get a pro rata share of that revenue also.
Awesome. And then here's the last question. It's a good one. Is social tokens a good alternative for VC investors if the founder wants to maintain ownership over the company?
So I think people are not really thinking the whole token thing through when it comes to securities. And I want this to be a solved problem, but none of the solutions that I have seen make sense to me. And the reason is that the fact that token activities are irrevocable and automatic, like, is their main selling point. So like I just did a podcast called Out of the Crisis where I talk about the pandemic and its various kind of leadership and solution challenges. And I just did an episode that's about to come out with Brian Armstrong from Coinbase. So of course we're all talking about crypto, and he's talking about the possibility in the future that crypto could replace lots of legal contracts and bureaucracy that deal with like cap table management contracts and all that stuff. And of course, from a technology point of view, that is true. The problem is that the things that the legal system provides that make it cumbersome are the features of the legal system, not the bugs. Because the fundamental problem with an irrevocable token is what happens if I say that you cheated me and you stole the token from me and I want you to give it back. And you're like, no, man, I followed the rules of my smart contract to the letter and it's mine. And I'm like, but you cheated. And you're like, no, I didn't. And then it's like, now what? Well, now we're going to have a legal dispute about whether this happened or not. Whether or not there was a contract that governed our relationship or it was just a math equation. But now we're going to enter the legal system. Legal system in our society has the final say on these matters. So judges and human beings are going to intervene to make these choices. And the technology is going to have to comply itself to those decisions, or we're going to have to become outlaws. And so I don't really think most of the use cases that and listen, there is an anarcho-capitalist like theory of distributed corporations with no oversight that owe no allegiance to any country or government that are unregulatable. And, but like when you really go down that road, like we're talking about like basically like terrorist cells and organizations. Like this is a dark road to go down. Maybe there are legitimate uses for such technology. Like I hope so. I'm actually really into decentralized technology, so I don't mean to paint it in a negative way, but like I don't see people really grappling with those facts and the conflict between the needs and features of the legal system and these tokens. So I can't wait to be proven wrong on this point. I'm an eager reader of the white papers on these points, and I look forward to somebody showing me why this is not the case. But so far, I haven't seen it.
I think we can count on you to do the long-term thinking involved in a lot of scenarios here. So
do my best.
Well done. The world's a better place with you in it, sir.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you, Christie. Thank you, Eric. This has been so fun. We appreciate your time. Be well. And we hope to have you back here, Eric, when you've done your next big thing.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me. Big shout out to Phoenix, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do stuff in person one day.
Great. Be well.
All right. Take care. Everyone stay safe.